All right, welcome back to a bonus episode of the Blasters and Blades podcast. So, hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies, a place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. So, without further ado, let me tell you what we're doing right now. We're getting ready to release some of the archive that we found from when we were the sci-fi shenanigans. We're going to get those up there for the posts that were brought down. We thought you might enjoy them, and so without further ado, let us roll that beautiful. Oh wait, they're going to sue me. Play it.
Hey, all you crazy sci-fi fans. Time for your daily dose of insanity over here at the Sci-Fi Shenanigans podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions. A place where the sky's the limit, space is the place, and nerds run the world. And without further ado...
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Sci-Fi Shenanigans podcast. We're back with another panel episode. For those of you who have cons that were canceled or just bored and need something to listen to, we recorded three of these episodes. This is the last one, but this one's going to be a slightly different take on military science fiction because all of our guests today are from the tiny little island known as the United Kingdom. And they're something I learned working with Tim is science fiction that comes out of the island is slightly different than ours. Ours being American, their sensibilities are a little bit different, and it affects sometimes the stories they tell. So I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to have some of them come on and talk about things from their perspective. So today we've gathered some authors from the vast array of the awesome British modern military science fiction greatness. And we're going to host that panel. So in alphabetical order, but not in order of importance to our hearts, we're going to let the guests tell us who they are and what they write, and if they have any military experience, they can throw that in as well. So we'll start with you, Ralph.
Well, I know you said not in order of importance, but I'd consider myself the least and the first amongst this great crowd you've got here. But firstly, JR, thank you very much for having me. So my name's Ralph Kern. I've been writing for around 6 years, 4 months, 21 days or thereabouts, probably about 3 hours as well. I remember that because I started writing on New Year's Day after a particularly heavy night on the lash. Decided to put together a bucket list, and one of those things was to write a book. So that's where my writing voyage started. I've written to this date. 7 books have been published, with an 8th coming out on the 7th of June. They're split between 3 series. The first series is called The Sleeping Gods. Is what I'd call a hard science fiction exploration of the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. A little bit of sort of a exploration of how humanity will evolve and look. My next series was called the Locust Trilogy. It's a little bit different. It's sort of set in contemporary times. It's more of a kind of mystery. I kind of describe it as a little bit of a love child of Lost, The Last Ship, and Battlestar Galactica. So it's kind of set in our times, but there's definitely science fiction underpinning the mystery of what goes on. And I would describe it as military science fiction as well, as there is a massive military component to it. And then finally, my most recent series, and the one which I would suggest prompted you to invite me onto your show, is called The Great War. This is a far, far future kind of thing, which when I kind of first came up with the concept, I sort of, the overriding elevator pitch was World War II in space. So it takes the events, battles, politics of the Second World War, and it puts it into a military science fiction setting, i.e. instead of Navy wet water warships, there's starships. Instead of sort of regular aircraft fighters and bombers and whatnot, there's starfighters, star bombers. and sort of tanks, mechs, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a series of books where I particularly take a section of related events and then sort of write a book around them. So the first one being Dunkirk, second one being the Hunt for the Bismarck, so on and so forth. So a little bit about me. I'm in real life, I'm a police officer. I've got responsibility for managing the one of the cities here, or one of the city centre here in sunny Birmingham. In terms of military experience, whilst I was at university, I was in the Army Reserve, and then I transferred through to what we call our Air Cadets, which is an organisation which sort of is based around the Royal Air Force in supporting children who've got an interest in that. So, say children 13 to 18. My job with them was as what's called a civilian instructor, taking kids flying in motor gliders. So giving them experience in flying aircraft or being in an aircraft that's being flown, I should say, which was one of the best weekend jobs I could possibly think of. It was great. And then from there, I joined what we call the MOD Police, Ministry of Defence Police, which is sort of a hybrid between a military or a conventional military service and a police service, sort of like fits the middle ground. I'm not sure if you've got an analogy over in the US. I'd have to do some more homework on that, but it kind of gives sort of an element of the it's for scenarios where you need the ability to respond with sort of a paramilitary force, but possibly in a civilian setting. That's probably a very, very loose example explanation, but I won't dwell on it anymore before going on to join the more regular police. So that is me in a nutshell.
So I'm going to be honest with you. We actually just invited you because you guys have cool accents. And you use words we've never heard of before.
Well, if you don't understand what the hell I'm on about, just give us a nudge, and I'll re-explain in your corrupted version of our language.
Okay. So all right. So next we have Miss
Hi,
Pollard.
Sci-Fi Shenanigans. Well, I write under the name Ashley R. Pollard. I'm a retired cognitive behavioural therapist, which you don't have in America because, well, you're Americans. It's kind of a psychologist, but it's a very practical, behavioural-based psychologist. And I've had a lifelong passion for science fiction and tabletop gaming. So my career started back as a freelancer for Fazer Corporation for Battletech. And I worked on the technical readout 3055, which then meant they had to rewrite the rules because I made my battle mech designs too good for their game. But we won't go into that. I've also been a columnist and reviewer for battle games and miniature war games magazines and Games Master International. Only one of those is still going because war game magazines tend to come and go. I have been writing now for about 8 years, in fiction. I have 2 series that you can actually go to and buy. The first is my Gatewalker universe, and the pitch line for that is Armored Trooper Votoms meets Stargate. But since most people don't know what Armored Trooper Votoms is, if I just say Starship Troopers, power armor in space, well, not in space, but through the Stargate, you kind of get the impression. There's 3 books in that. My second series is called The World of Dre. It's near future. I haven't got a date for it, but it's kind of near future. Russian Civil War, where the Russians are dealing with European cyber tanks, German cyber tanks. Sort of German cyber tanks. It's an alliance of Poland and Hungary and the Visegrad Group and the Baltic Alliance. And in the editing process, it's ongoing creative arena. I've got a Cthulhu novel, which I have to go back and fix a plot point to. And I'm currently working on the next book of the Gatewalker series, which is a side story featuring one of the characters from the first 3 books who is a side character, giving him his own novel. He's a spook, and they're going back to this planet to meet aliens and go boldly when nobody's gone before. Is that covered base? I think that's probably covered the bases.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we have Mr. Tim C. Taylor.
Hi. Well, I guess first up, I should say, having read Gatewalker books and Great War, I'm a fan of Ashley R. Pollard and of Ralph Kern. So that's one of the reasons I'm particularly excited to be here today. I write as Tim C. Taylor. The C is only there in my professional life. I think I started writing, it was something to do with beer. I can't remember exactly why, but it was 2001. I went full-time 2011. I mostly write space opera and military science fiction. The Human Legion series is probably my most read. But at the moment, I'm writing a series of novels in the Four Horsemen universe, which is a mechs and mercenaries a series in Chris Kennedy Publishing that's co-designed by Mark Wondry and Chris Kennedy. And in fact, in perhaps a day or so, I'm going to start co-writing a novel with my publisher, Chris Kennedy, which is something that's a little bit scary, but I hear it's something that you might have done something similar to that, JR, at some point.
Yeah, co-writing can be a unique endeavor.
Or
so luckily I had some good bosses.
Cool.
All right, so now we will define our term. So what is military science fiction, and throw in as much of what makes it different in the UK compared to America when you answer this as you want. And throughout this episode, pepper in anything that makes you guys unique and special. So we're going to do this one not in alphabetical order because I don't want the same people to get to go first all the time. Otherwise, the person at the end just goes, what Bob said. We learned that already. So we'll go with Miss Ashley. What is military science fiction?
So I'm going to be very contrary now and say that in my experience, defining a genre comes up what I call edge rules in gaming. It's when you run your tank down the side of the board, knowing that the people can't swing round and attack you from the side because they'd be going off the board. And so, I have a slight problem that every time I enter a discussion about what's science fiction, it comes, people go, well, it's this, it's that. I kind of know what it is when I see it, but I think the more that you nail down the definitions, the more subdivided it becomes. So for me, I think the prime thing is it's a military setting. So a chain of command and characters who act like soldiers, marines, sailors and pilots. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have a story with hot doggers, Maverick in Top Gun and stuff, but the setting for me has to be really convincing. Yeah.
Okay. Tim, you're next.
Yeah, and I'm with Ashley. I don't like to narrow it down too much, and I know it when I see it. But the thing that defines military science fiction is military. There's some kind of organized force that we would recognize as being a military today, and to make it military science fiction, it could be lots of other things as well. But if you took the military aspect out of the story, it just wouldn't work anymore. It wouldn't make sense.
All right, and last but not least, we have Mr. Ralph Kern.
Yeah, we're facing probably the problem you identified is I do agree absolutely with both what Ashley and Tim have said. For me, military science fiction, let's pass it down a little bit. You've got science fiction, which generally, although not always, takes place in space, albeit it can take place on sort of primarily an Earth-based setting, even whether in the future, in contemporary times, or even the past. Generally with the trappings of what makes science fiction is some kind of science-based problem or solution to that problem. Now, to add the bolt-on of military, part of the solution to the problem or part of the setting is going to be a military aspect to it, to which I think then, much like regular science fiction and the definition of hard science fiction or not, to call something military science fiction, it's got to, or in my mind, I should say, it has to have the authentic feel of involving a military organisation, either as protagonist, antagonist, or the framework of which that story operates. And it can be either relatively soft, with I would argue something probably like, in my view, probably Star Trek or something like that, where it sort of underpins things, but it doesn't really make sense when it bears close examination. I.e., why does a captain go on an away mission and all that kind of stuff, all the way up to sort of quite hard science fiction, where you probably base it on sort of an existing military structure. Now, in my view, it's often not sort of as, or certainly future science fiction, it's not necessarily bounded by what we think is realistic. So, for example, if I thought of sort of a lot of the kind of really excellent military science fiction I enjoy, quite often that involves sort of guys jumping into fighters and warping across star systems, and it's like, it makes for an entertaining read, but it's not necessarily how I envisage what real future war would look like. But albeit, one of the most important things is a consistent framework and an authentic feeling framework, and especially around the culture that's involved. Okay, and that's my answer.
All right, and it is a good answer. So now I went over to the fine folks at Wikipedia University, because we know they are never wrong. And here's what they had to say. So military science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction that features the use of science fiction technology, mainly weapons, for military purposes, and usually principal characters that are members of a military organization involved in military activity, usually during a war. So they could use a copy editor, occurring sometimes in outer space or on different planet or planets. It exists in literature, comics, film, and video games. And so it goes on to basically repeat that same sentiment multiple times in multiple paragraphs. So I will spare you, dear listener, since you've listened to it twice before. But given the definition from the fine folks at the Wiki University, do you need to change your answer, Tim?
No, I'd go along with that. I've seen the rest of the definition, but it goes under too many specific things. But I think if you keep it's to do with military, I think that's fine. I wouldn't say, for example, that it needs to be refighting historical things in space. That's exactly what Ralph's doing to great effect, but I think that's quite...
Hey!
It doesn't have to. Most things don't do that, I think. They borrow from what's happened, and I think the idea that you said, Ralph, of it has to have an authentic culture to be... to work really well. I think that's an important point. But I think that's probably anticipating a question about what makes good military science fiction. But yeah, I'm happy with my earlier answer.
All right, Ralph.
I'd agree with Tim. I'll put more of a focus in that definition on the military culture and making that culture feel authentic. There is no difference in my mind that there's a different mindset within the military than there is perhaps with civilian life. So I would probably put a more the culture would be an important addition to that definition, but generally I'd agree with it, with the sole exception that I don't believe it necessarily requires sort of the futuristic technology that it seems to allude to. So that features the use of science fiction technology, mainly weapons. I think you can do a damn good military science fiction set in our times with contemporary equipment, weapons training, etc. Where, as I said to you in my put together definition, the problem itself might be a science fiction problem. I don't know, stopping an asteroid from hitting the Earth or whatever. You'd still use sort of what we would recognise as conventional technology, but it might be military personnel who do it.
All right, and Ashley?
Well, I'm going to stick with my answer because whilst I think the wiki definition is reasonable, the problem I have, as I said before, is defining things with lists of tick boxes. You end up forgetting the most important thing about stories, which is a character in a setting with a problem. So, military setting, military characters, chain of command, these are what make military SF, in my humble opinion.
Okay. Well, speaking of the characters and the vibes, do you guys feel that the sentiment, science fiction, military science fiction written by and for British audiences is different than, say, what we would see with America? Because every military has its own sort of culture. Do you feel like yours is different, or is that universal? And we'll start with Ralph this time.
I think the gap is closing. The US and the UK have been allies, very close allies, and dare I say it, very close friends since, for over a century now. 100 years or so or more, especially around the age of about World War I, the UK military and the American military were essentially geared to be able to face off against each other, which seems absolutely bizarre now. But that was sort of like a hangover from what happened in the 18th and 19th century. Whereas now we've kind of I think the gap has closed somewhat. We speak the same speak, in terms of like NATO radio comms, that sort of thing. That being said, our military force is undeniably many, many times smaller than yours and undoubtedly far less capable. However, what we do well, we pride ourselves on doing very, very well. So our special forces, for example, our SAS, it's fair to say they're legendary throughout the world, and our conventional or more conventional military, I should say, have a very good reputation amongst other nations, or so we like to think, as professional soldiers, very elite, very keep cool in fire. But we've also got a massive and long history as well, which has again stemmed from the 19th and 18th centuries, when this small island we're on had an empire that spanned the world, and from our tiny little island, we were an absolute pivot for world events. And there's a hangover of us taking a massive amount of pride in that. That we still keep to this day. So what are the kind of differences that probably still exist? Again, a lot of our sort of individual mission functions, I should say, are plug and play. Probably the primary difference is, whilst we keep a substantial ability to project an expeditionary force, I think our days of being able to win a war sort of in isolation, we'd probably need more to view it in a collaborative function, whereas America definitely retains the ability, maybe not the will, but the ability to be able to project a significant amount of force on its own and unilaterally, should it so wish to. It's just through sheer diplomacy that you feel that the best way is to do that through partnership. Whereas if we were to be desiring to take the battle to enemy waters or land, we would probably have to start utilising our negotiation skills to try and bring in other partners to support us with that. I'd say there's probably a hell of a lot of other specifics as well that are different of our different weapon systems and whatnot. But again, there's only so many ways you can skin a cat when it comes to sort of infantry tactics and weapons. And because we've been working so closely over the last best part of 100 years, our tactics and skills and drills would be recognisable to yourselves. It would just be the specifics that might cause some questions or confusion.
So don't sell your tiny little island short, because if you just resurrect the corpse of Churchill and he give a rousing speech, you guys would be all over it. You'd be conquering the moon already.
He had a way with words.
But Ashley, do you believe that the culture in the British military is significantly different enough that it affects the type of stories that you guys produce?
Well, that's really two questions. Culture difference definitely exists. Whether it affects the stories, that's kind of more arguable. From my perspective, I'm very much an Americanophile. Rah, 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 America. If I could be an American citizen, I would choose to be an American citizen. So, I'm slightly biased, and I kind of think the American military is just, the best military in the world. Caveats. Don't count the British out. I mean, when we took back the Falklands back in the 80s, the Russians had to reassess Britain's military capacity, and that we went from being kind of somewhere near the bottom, down with the French perhaps, to actually, they uprated us and went, wow, who would have thought a small country like Britain could extend military force 12,500 miles away to a godforsaken island in the South Atlantic. And not only that, we did some really quite incredible things there. Normally, you expect in battle to outnumber your opponent about 4-1. We retook the islands outnumbered by 4-1, and we inflicted 4 times as many casualties, approximately, on the Argentinians as the Argentinians did on us. So, yeah, I do think there's a big cultural difference, but it's not in those things about weapons and tactics, because I think, Ralph has said, we're very comparable. We can slot into an American table of organisation and equipment, supply this bit of the force. But there is something about the British character. One of the things I noticed on this podcast is you called me Miss Ashley, and in England we would just dispense with all that formalities, whereas I noticed with my American friends, there's a lot more of that formalities, like, thank you, sir, and stuff. So I think there are differences. Whether that actually adds up to anything is another matter.
Okay, I think some of those differences that you mentioned with the perception of what is polite, etc., is also regional in the U.S. So, what about you, Tim? You got anything to add? You think the British military culture is significantly different enough that it affects the stories? Because I do know you produced a certain book about UK military science fiction.
Yeah. So I'm very interested in the other people's answers here, because I helped to put together an anthology, Empire at War, British Military Science Fiction, in 2015-16. And I wrote an article on what makes British military science fiction distinctive. And I think I fell in the trap of projecting myself onto my answer and just feeling I had to reach out and draw an answer. And I've been looking at it ever since, and I don't really believe my own answer, which is interesting because it does match a lot of what Ralph said, which is the idea that a clear thing that I can point to, the difference between British attitude and American attitude, is Britons don't feel they have the weight in the world to project force and make things happen, except in alliance. Therefore, I suggested British authors would have more alliances to defeat the bad people. But having written that in that article, I don't see that at all. I see it in my own writing a little bit, but I think that's just projecting myself. There's got to be cultural differences in there. It has to be, but I'm not sure I can really distinguish what they are. And when I look at myself, I mean, I've written or published about 30 military science fiction novels so far, and I really don't see much of a sales difference averaged out across Britain and the UK relative to the size of the market. In other words, it's not as if American military science fiction is more, or military science fiction is more popular in America than it is over here. So it's interesting. There's got to be differences in there, but I'm not entirely clear enough to me what they are. But I think even if I'm unconscious of them, I think there will be differences, and I think that adds to the whole variety, which has got to be a good thing.
Can I come in and just say something?
Okay, well, sure.
One of the things I noticed, going what Tim has just said and what Ralph has said, is that there's a certain tone that British squaddies refer to their officers as Ruperts, which you wouldn't get in America. And I'm just going to leave it at that, but there is definitely a cultural tone difference.
Yeah.
And if I may, if we're adding one more thing, one of the things I've noticed with the Great War series is, whilst the story arc itself is going to be encompassing the whole of the Second World War, the first 3 books are Europe-centric. Obviously, the US only got involved a little bit later, following the Date of Infamy. Albeit, you obviously provided material support and diplomatic support before then. But I've got a lot of reviews and a lot of kind people who are emailing me about the Great War series, and there's several veterans who served for a long time, including flatteringly one colonel who served in Vietnam through to a few years ago, and he said, I didn't have any knowledge whatsoever about Dunkirk until the movie came out and I was reading your book, which was really interesting to me, because it's one of the defining events of the Second World War for us, and it helped define what how we viewed ourselves in the Second World War. And there's no doubt it kind of put us on the back foot for some time. Our arrogance, if you like, about being the dominant force in Europe was given a good knock. But what's clear is what are major events to yourselves and what are major events to us are different. So our historical perspective of the world is somewhat different as well. And there was another review which basically said the Second World War didn't start until Pearl Harbor, and I was like, no, that wasn't quite the case. So again, it shows.
3 guesses where that guy's from. I said 3 guesses where that guy's from.
Absolutely. So it goes to show, what even our perspective of history does depend on which side of the pond we are from. And it's not that they're wrong or we're wrong. It's just that that is what helps define us. So it's just an additional thought that's where we come from, where you come from, and so on and so forth.
All right. One different I want to see if you can still agree on, because when I deployed to Iraq the second time, we did work with some of the British territorials, and I seem to remember it was 145 degrees at noon. They stopped for hot tea when we were chugging whatever frozen beverage we could find. So do you think future British space militaries are going to still drink tea? We'll start with you,
Just
Ms.
say,
Ashley.
drop the miss, please. It feels far too formal.
Okay.
Wow, that's a question I didn't expect. Yes, we'll still drink tea, and we'll have our little pinky fingers out whilst we do it, and we'll have the appropriate biscuits that you can dunk, that don't break and fall into your cup of tea, because that wouldn't be British.
Okay. Outstanding. What do you think, Tim? Still going to drink space tea? Not even to say. Are you going to be the odd guy out, Ralph? You think the British future space navies are going to drink the tea?
Only in terms of between you, me, Miss Ashley, and Tim. I hate tea, but again, it comes to the culture. I think that between now and the day the sun goes dark, sort of any kind of British contingent in any kind of stellar or interstellar expedition will carry a box of Tetley with them for brewing up with.
So I'm from the south of the United States, which has our own somewhat unique culture, and we know the truth is the only way tea is supposed to be drank is iced and sweet. So basically, brown sugar water.
Yeah.
And in some cities in the South, they call that table wine. So the definition of for military sci-fi included the backdrop of war. But do you think that you can have a military science fiction story without the war component? Tim?
Yes, most of them do, but it's not necessary. And in fact, my Human Legion series, the first 3 novels, there's a civil war that takes place. And it's all happening sort of off camera. The effects are being felt, but they're not actually directly involved, none of the characters. So you've got military operations, but they're the people, they're mutinying and they're stragglers sort of capturing bases and stuff. But it's not, although they're part of an organized military or they've come from it, they're not actually involved in the war. It's all off camera. And that was the first 3 books. And they sold, well, I mean, over 100,000 copies, and no one's come back to me and said, you did it wrong, because there wasn't a war. Although I must admit, I felt quite relieved when I got to the 4th book, and then I put a more conventional warfare from there on in. So, no, I don't agree with that.
All right.
Again, I agree. It's not necessary. It normally is part of it, but it's not, strictly speaking, necessary. For me, as I said in the initial definition, it's more about the military culture and framework that defines it as military science fiction. There is some excellent what I would consider military science fiction that either don't feature war or war is very much a secondary part of it, of the story, not least. And I suppose it depends how you read it, but the way I read, say, The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, it was far less about the conflict than the returning home, and how the world had moved on each time, and the character, I forget his name, was trying to readjust. I suppose a metaphor for what you and your colleagues might have faced, JR, your colleagues and friends, coming home each time and having to readjust. But they're trying to think of some other ones as well. I've struggled to pluck them out of my dim and dusty memory banks, but yeah, I think it's far more important as to the definition of military science fiction around the culture than necessarily the war itself. Again, I'll use the Star Trek analogy, which takes place in a military-ish setting, i.e. on a starship, which follows a Navy rank structure. But up until, was it Deep Space Nine? They never went into an actual war. So there's literally decades of history to that series before they even get into a major conflict.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, you can have military science fiction which isn't about the war directly. I mean, I recently read Brad Torgenson's story, The Chaplain's War, where the war component is really, they're all in a prison of war camp, and it's just about how they cope with that. And of course, there's also the other quite famous story, Enemy Mine by Barry B. Longyear, which was made into a film, not a very good film, but a film, which was all about two soldiers, pilots, star pilots, stranded on a planet, having to work together and building up the friendship. But it was definitely set against a background of war. And I'd also, as one final observation, say, well, in real life, a lot of what the military does falls under operations other than war. So, yeah, but I'd add some caveats because that's the way I roll and say, well, you know, how you sell it to the reader in terms of the spiel on the back to make sure that they're not buying this thinking they're going to get something X and they get something Y, which is not to their taste. So, yeah, with caveats. That would be my answer.
All right. So part of what defines the genre are the common tropes. So are there any tropes that you feel have to be in a story for it to be classified as military science fiction? Ralph?
There are a platter, if you like, of tropes. And one of the things I've found with my own writing is that when you first start out, someone, you go to sort of like amateur writing groups and they say, avoid tropes, make sure you steer clear of tropes. And then actually what you learn as you start to sell books is people want the tropes. I'll suggest that there's probably some kind of ratio. This isn't worked out scientifically, but in order for someone to find the next book, they've got to know that the next book is 75% close to what they like and similar to other books they've read, and then maybe 25% of that book adds a new take or a difference to it. That being said, there are many tropes that one can take. The inevitable sort of conflict between enlisted and officers, the conflict between the military and the government that sends them tends to be a big one. Not least, obviously, the trope of the protagonist relationship with the antagonists. For me, one of the ones I'm going into in the Great War is that for the average foot soldier or sailor or spacer in this case, and so on, actually there's probably a hell of a lot more similarities between the lower ranked people of opposing sides than there is with their own kind of organisations. A soldier from one side is probably going to have more in common. But that being said, they've still obviously got a job to do, and that job is to defeat their enemy. So there's that kind of almost dichotomy of, hey, wait a second, if you'd met this guy or by a quirk of nature, this guy had been, born in the same nation as you, you'd probably be buddies because they have a similar value set. So that's one trope that is kind of, can be like kind of quite troublesome to explore. Without sort of overly giving sympathy to, say, like especially in the Great War case, sort of like the Nazis, which are an utterly despicable organisation. Yet, anyway, I'm diving too much into that. I think you need tropes. The obvious. What do you need in it to? What tropes do you need to be classified as military science fiction? You don't need any of them, but I would suggest that you have a look at sort of what tropes there are and think, can I give them a new spin? Can I give them a new take? Or are they useful to further my story or my characters' arcs?
Okay. And next we have Ashley.
I'm going to go with what Jim Butcher said at a convention panel once. Tropes are the tools that writers use to build their stories. So yeah, you've got to have your tropes. I think the problem that you find with fandom talking about tropes being overused is what they're really saying is that this story didn't engage me as a reader, because there are no new tropes. There are no new stories. All we can bring is a new treatment of the ideas to the reader. And, and that for military science fiction means a military setting, which may or may not be a war. Characters may or may not be fighting other people. They might be fighting the environment. You could write a story about rescuing a colony from aliens, for instance. Oh, they did that, didn't they, in the film? So that's what I say.
Yeah.
All right. She has spoken. Tim, do you dare disagree with her?
Well, I hear something about the arrows, so probably not. But no, I think that's an excellent thing. I hadn't heard that before. Jim Butcher, tropes are your toolkit. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You don't need to use any of them, but you're probably wise to employ some of them as part of your toolkit. But I would say you need to use the tropes that make your story the best one it can. I mean, I know some people will pick things and try to write to market, and some people can do that very successfully. But for me, I have to be excited by the story, so I will use the tropes that engage me. And sometimes I start using one, but then it doesn't really fit in the story, so I push it to the corner and to the edge, so you can't traverse your turret and get it in the way or whatever. But yeah, basically they're part of the toolkit. So, but no one trope is necessary.
All right. So the one of the obvious components of a military science fiction is the culture. So the future.
To interrupt, Daddy, but Miss Crystal bought you.
Sorry, my son delivered coffee, so I couldn't exactly put it away. But so one of the things
My dad's the best because he got me a frappuccino.
All right. Sorry about that interruption, people. But it's coffee, so you have to put up with it. So one of the tropes or parts of a military science fiction book is the culture of the military. A lot of times what you see in military science fiction is a Navy Marine Corps base, but do you think that is necessary, and do you think any of that will change? What's your opinion on how you set up your space militaries? It used to be, like I said, it was the Space Navy, Space Marines, and that was the extent of it. Do you think that will continue? Will future space military culture be based on the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, or even we have a new Space Force? So I imagine the rest of the world will eventually follow suit.
Yeah.
Miss Ashley, you get to go first this time.
That's a sarcasm, by the way. I think this is a very difficult question because we don't really have a solid foundation to work from. And if you actually look at space combat, and I was involved, or still am involved, in a group called Science Fiction Conflict Simulations, who discuss the problems of space combat and how to model it in a war game or a board game. Spaceships are not ships or submarines in space. They are their own thing. So I think culturally they will be their own thing. However, to address the question specifically, it's going to be a mix. Parts of it are going to be Navy because Navy's quite good at doing long-haul missions and the logistics that go with that. But some of the operational stuff is going to be much more Air Force because you're going to be launching patrols that go off and do stuff. And then you're going to need the poor old grunts because you can't hold a planet with a spaceship. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting. I pity we're not going to be around to see it all, but it's going to be an interesting to see what actually happens. So there.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, it's difficult to say because it all depends. So things like technological constraints, because we can't actually go and fight a war around Jupiter at the moment because we haven't got the technology to do it. So that will determine some aspects of how it works. But it does appear as if whatever it will be, there needs to be self-contained and making decisions and having all your a single command decision and combine forces in one place under a single unified command does seem to be a requisite, which does seem to be, as my understanding, similar to the concept of the US Marine Corps, which is probably why it often gets used as a model. Another thing about Marines, actually, is for most of their existence, they were primarily there to board ships and to repel boarders. I think you can go back as far as the Battle of Salamis, where you first see that I'm aware of. So I think that may well become something that isn't perhaps such a big deal today that will become. But also, I think it will be partly dependent upon what conflicts first arrive, because I think my understanding, military organizations, they tend to react to the last war they fought and be good at fighting the last war. So it depends what's going to happen. I don't know.
Okay. Ralph?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that and say that I don't think we really know yet until we know or the first conflict happens, and I think the first conflict will help design or lay the foundations which will then subsequently evolve through future conflicts. Instinctively, I think that probably something like the Navy would provide would provide a suitable starting framework. However, that being said, I think humanity's future exploration of the solar system, which I believe is inevitable, and sort of our interstellar exploration, which is not necessarily inevitable, but could happen. They're going to provide different eras, and those eras are going to give a different look and feel to how the military works. So, in the near future, I'd say if there's a conflict in space, then it'll probably be sort of your perhaps your new space force that would lead it. Is that going to be primarily, sort of taking out enemy satellites and whatnot, the kind of the very near future thing, or is it going to be, looking into the future, is it going to be like conflicts around the moon or however it may be, which will probably still be controlled by Earth as we expand out into the solar system and into the universe. Then the command structure would have to be more independent. So whilst within the solar system, you could still say, subject to its information control and operational security in terms of communications, your forces could still be controlled by Earth. But let's project far into the future, where sort of humanity is expanding out into the stars, and where that might not be the case. So your units, your ship or whatever, would have to be far more independent. The captains and whatnot given far more autonomy, and then we'd probably harken back and we would look back further rather than nearer to the days of sailing ships, where you would have where you'd have crews that were going on journeys for many months outside of any kind of recognised command structure, and you've obviously got the commander will have to keep things on task and on mission. And who knows what sort of society or military culture that would present. I mean, back to what Tim says, one of the other functions of the Marines, as well as boarding enemy ships, was keeping order on ships as well. Are you going to find that kind of situation, especially with independent commands, which are out there for months and years? Is discipline going to start becoming an issue? I'd hope not, because training and commitment would overrule that. But what if it didn't? So I think it's going to be very interesting. Instinctively, I think the Navy would provide a model. I agree with Ashley that there's elements of the of kind of an Air Force kind of mission focus. However, the Navy can do that effectively as well. Your Navy has more fighters and bombers than our Royal Air Force, so you can effectively do that. You've got the ability to launch, or the US Navy has the ability to launch satellites in a limited capacity. So it's fairly well independently set up, as well as a good model. But I think a lot of it would be self-evolved, especially if we face some kind of conflict between when there's an established space force and now, where perhaps it'll be sort of scientists and engineers who would lead the exploration. Ben Bova wrote a very good set of stories called the Grand Tour, which had a war in the asteroid belt, and it wasn't soldiers and Marines, it was sort of engineers and scientists who had to sort of form together a military force, so which might well create something entirely new and different than we could ever envisage. So I think it's an open question. I haven't got an answer for you, and I don't think anyone can have an answer for you right now. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
So we actually do have someone who had an answer. Tim has on his website, thehumanlegion.com, an article about the use of the old British regimental system for unit autonomy among the stars. And speaking of their websites, all of that, as usual, dear listener, is in the show notes. And if you like what they're saying, their Amazon page, they have a little bell. It says buy. You just go there and you click buy on everything they've ever written. They really like that. That is how you show them you love them and that you like what they had to say. But speaking of the military, how important do you think it is for military science fiction to stay on point with military ranking, tactics, and technology? How far can you stray from today's established norms and still meet reader expectations? Tim?
Well, I like to make it clearly slightly different, at least slightly different, so people aren't expecting it to be the way that the US Army is or the US Marine Corps is, because otherwise the slightest deviation and you may get criticism. I have to say that I've never had anyone come up to me and say, you got this wrong. Well, actually they did, but that was in betas and alpha readings, but no reviewer. I did know an author, Philip Richards, who used to get driven a little bit mad, I think, because he wrote stories about the English dropship infantry, and he wrote them while he was a British Army platoon sergeant in Afghanistan, and he was forever getting told off because he got his terminology wrong by Americans. So he used to get this thing at the front about I'm British and it's British Army terminology. But I'm surprised. I've never had that because I obviously don't have the military background. But I guess as long as it's clearly not quite the same as any current-based real military, then everybody knows I've got to adjust it. It's slightly not what I'm expecting. But as long as you're consistent within that and it all makes sense, then I think you're fine.
So is he the one who wrote
the
yes. series?
Excellent.
So I've been on a letter writing campaign to the Queen. She's been ignoring me about releasing him from his service, so he might continue writing that series. So if you know anybody that I might need to write, you let me know. Yeah. All right. What about you, Ralph? How far from established norms do you think we can stray and still be military science fiction and meet reader expectations?
As I said before, I think the consistency is the issue, probably more than sort of meeting the what is current. So as long as you have sort of a consistent rank structure that feels authentic and is to a certain extent defined, because I think the people who read military science fiction are quite process driven. They like sort of definitions, and part of the challenge for us authors is to do it without having lumps of exposition in there, if you follow my meaning. But yeah, as long as it's consistent and authentic, then I think that readers are quite forgiving of things like rank. I mean, one of the challenges I faced in the Great War was, so for the Kingdom Aerospace Forces, the Royal Air Force, I decided to use Royal Air Force rankings rather than sort of converting them to a more recognisable rank structure. So without going into it in too much detail, the rank structure of the RAF is based roughly around the Navy. So you have like flight lieutenants, squadron leaders, wing commanders, group captains, rather than lieutenants, majors, captains, all that kind of stuff. So I was really sort of wrestling with whether I should use that or just sort of convert it back to a more conventional and recognisable rank structure that's used elsewhere other than just with ourselves and the Indian Air Force, as it happens. And you know what, I decided to keep with the RAF rankings, and I've not received one single negative review or comment about that. So, which goes to show that even when it's unfamiliar to a reader, i.e., an American reader or whatnot, then they're still willing to go with it, and they're still willing to view it as legitimate. In relation to sort of the tactics and technology, again, it has to be consistent within the framework of the story. Some of the best examples, for example, are Marco Cluse's series, where he essentially defines the limitations of his units, as we should all do. But him being a German chap, it's all very efficiently done. And you absolutely know what everything's capable of and how tactics arrive from the personnel they've got and the technology. And it kind of makes sense to me. So yeah, as long as these things are consistent within the framework of the technology base that you have, then the tactics will fall out of that, and they'll make for sort of the interesting part of your problem solving in your main story.
And you've just illustrated one of the differences for American ears is we say lieutenant and you say lieutenant.
That's right, yeah. We even on
some of the
sergeant differently depending on what regiment you go to. So some people it's SERGANT, and for other regiments it's Sarge, but SARGANT, which is again you're probably going to go into warily, so to speak, and at some point explain that that's a regimental difference rather than a rubbish proofreading.
And some of that has creeped in some of the military documentaries. If you watch like on I don't know, Nat Geo, Curiosity Stream, wherever you find them, well, they'll have, if it's produced in the UK, they'll have it spelled wrong, and then you read the comments and everyone's like, "You can't spell! How dare you put that on the screen spelled wrong?"
Yeah.
I've seen that in some of the reviews. All right, so Ashley, how far do you think you can stray from established norms and still meet reader expectations?
Well, again, another great question. I think it comes down to setting. Both of my series are written in the near future, so I don't really stray from the current norms. So my American Gatewalker series uses American rank structures, though I mix it up by having the setting as a unified combatant command. So I've got, Air Force, Navy, Marines, etc., soldiers there, which allows for a little bit of dialogue interactions because, get my civilian characters, well, why is this character called this? Why is this character called that? And I can have a little gloss where the Marine says, well, he's an Air Force and he's Army and I'm Marine and you're going to call me this because that's the way it is in the Marines, but I'm the same rank as that person there, but you call something different. So, it can be a useful thing. When I was doing the Russian series, I actually had to go away and research all the Russian ranks, and I put them in a glossary in the books because they don't have. I mean, they have their equivalents, but they don't call them privates. It's called Radoiva and Efrita and Mlitche Sergeant, for their names, which I have all in the books. So I'd argue that if you're going to do a far future setting, then you really need to make your ranks a part of the world building. And, we have a lot of history that we can call back on. We can go back to the Greeks, we can go back earlier than that to Chinese history even. And you can farm that and or mine it for interesting example. I was thinking of one. Sorry, I got distracted. Michael Z. Williamson wrote a book, A Long Time to Now, which is a military story set in the past of future time travel. And he addresses that very same thing where the Americans are talking to some Romans they meet. And the squaddies are saying basically, well, call the lieutenant, he should be a centurion. And one of the guys saying, no, because a centurion is not an officer. He needs to be called a legate. And that's what they do. So I think, yeah, that's the way you go with it.
Okay, I've read that book. Even have a review for it on my website. So that was interesting. I understand he's even going to write a part 2. So this is a reader-submitted question that they wanted us to discuss, but we see some military science fiction stories include a romantic element. So do you think that you can have a romantic element and it still fit with reader expectations for military science fiction, or does that make it transition into being a sci-fi romance novel? And Ashley, you're first this time, but not just because you're a girl, I promise. It's just I'm rotating through.
As the token girl, I'd say only with the lightest of touches as part of the character development. So, as Tim will tell you, because he's read my books, there's some romance between a couple of the characters, but it's not front and center. It's just, they hang out together. One of the biggest disappointments that I've read recently was a series by, dare I say it, Rachel Bach, who did a Paradox porn trilogy, really interesting power armor in space, which against the merchant background as a mercenary, and it was. I loved all that bit of it, but the romance was so front and center that she sacrificed the military aspects of the novel, or the paramilitary aspects of the novel, with the romance. So, yeah, that didn't work so much for me. Good story, but didn't work for me.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think you asked, does it fit in with reader expectations? And I think the answer to that is depends on the reader and depends upon what that reader wants at the time. So, I mean, I've read military SF with romance, and as long as it doesn't break the military aspect, which we've said several times, it's important, it's authentic, then, yeah, I quite like that personally. Not always, but from time to time. It's very difficult to write, though, because, well, I mean, as with the Gatewalker series, I mean, the characters that Ashley wrote there, well, they're kind of busy most of the novel. They don't really have time to sort of sit down and mooch at each other. And I think that's the problem I've found writing as well. I've intended to put in romantic threads in a number of books, and then there's been no way to put that in easily, which I guess is quite realistic, but it's all happening off camera or elsewhere. But other people love it, I must admit. But I mean, one of my first book I wrote for the Four Horsemen universe, for example, I got a 1-star review on Amazon because it had broken the whole attitude of the Four Horsemen series by having character development, and I thought that was a betrayal. So, other people obviously will say, well, that's brilliant because we like it. It's not the other books didn't have character development. I don't know why they said that, but it just goes to show you can't do anything with the expectation you're going to please every reader, because they all come with a different set of expectations and prejudices.
Okay. And Ralph, romance in military sci-fi.
There are as many answers to this as there are readers who will potentially read your books, and each one has a different tolerance for it. I mean, personally, I deal with it with a very light touch. However, I do acknowledge that, what is the reasons why we fight? Often it's for family, friends, and loved ones. If we pass that down into the loved ones, that inevitably means that there's romance involved there somewhere. And also, you've got to balance that against the fact that generally any military is going to be primarily staffed with relatively young people. I think in lots of media, sort of the average age of your soldier, squaddy, sailor, or whatnot seems to be magnified by doubles the age, isn't it? Mostly they're sort of 18 to 25-year-olds or thereabouts who inevitably are going to be interested in one another if it's a mixed well, I suppose not even if it's a mixed gender crew, but personally I deal with it with a light touch. However, I do sort of acknowledge it on occasion, and again, one of the things you've got to tread warily of is that different readers and reader groups have different tolerances to moral values. So, for example, there's certainly when I was in serving in the reserves, and in my earlier days as a police officer, shall we say, sports sex wasn't uncommon. But that might not fit in with the moral values of someone who believes that relationships should be strictly within a family background. So you've got to kind of tread warily with it. And the one thing I've learned is probably sort of give a nod to it. It's an important part of the human condition, but generally the readers, I don't think, want of military fiction, science fiction, don't want to duck down into the nitty gritty, shall we say.
Okay. And that's also especially important if you have family members as your first line readers. I had a scene of such in my Demons of Corlear story in Tim's universe, and my mother was reading it, and she sent it back with a note that was politely saying, I don't know what you and your wife are doing, but you need to practice and do it better because this sucks. And I have never included another one of those scenes again.
Well, when your parents say you need to find Jesus, you've done something right or wrong.
All right. So speaking of the combat, which we've talked about before, how do you balance the reader expectations for weapons in science fiction with what we call the rule of cool? And today, Tim, you're first.
Well, it's just as we've said in the last question, really, different readers are looking for different things. And I mean, I write novels in the mech series. These are Casper's, Combat Assault System Personal. I don't really believe in mechs, but that doesn't matter because the characters do, and it's authentic, and it all makes sense within the context. And as long as it's consistent and as long as it feels authentic, I think a lot of people will be happy to run with that. And of course, there are mechs on the covers, and that's where cover art becomes very important, because if you think, oh, I don't like mechs, that's a silly idea, you won't buy the book, which is absolutely fine, because there are plenty of people who love to do exactly that. So, yeah, you can play it in different ways. But certainly, if something is really pretty cool in the rule of cool, it gives you a lot of excuses. You can excuse a lot of that if something's really cool.
All right, Ralph.
How I think if we have realistic space combats, it would be first shot, first kill from beyond visual range. You'll be firing at a dot on a radar, and the people on the receiving end, the first they'll know about it is when they're dissipating atoms. Spaceships are probably going to be quite delicate things, even if they are by their own sort of token, sort of heavily armored warships or whatever. It's still going to be sort of, over very quickly, which probably doesn't make for sort of that dramatic scenes, although albeit David Waver does it very well in the Hannah Harrington series, so it can be done. If we go to the other side, you've got with the rule of cool side of things. There's no doubt that things like your Star Wars battle, your Rogue One and before battles rather than the new series are spectacular visual fests, and you can certainly do an excellent sort of literary versions of those as well. So in the Great War, for example, there's lots of kind of dogfights between fighters with sort of like some nods towards like real physics. They have to sort of decelerate into battle and rather than accelerate into battle often and things like that. But it's mostly setups to try and create those kind of swirling dogfights of World War II, which I don't believe for an instant would be anything like what realistic military or space military conflict would be like. Then on the other side, I've got Erebus, where I have a number of what I would deem to be sort of relatively realistic sort of space battles as well. And I worked hard to still make them dramatic and whatnot, as the sort of tussling and using skills and knowledge, experience, and tactics to try and get the first strike on their opponent, rather than it being about the battle itself. And so, yeah, it's it's an interesting one. Both can work, but again, it all comes back to the consistent framework of what you're writing in.
Okay. And Ashley.
Gosh, well, Ralph and Tim have kind of nailed it, but what I would say is that you can make any weapon fighting story boring. It's very easy to make a combat sequence boring by not choosing your timing and pacing and stuff that grips the reader. So for me, I'm kind of thinking it's all about the setting and your assumptions about your setting. So I write fairly near future, no more than 60 years out. So all the weapons I'm going to be featuring are not too outrageous because they have to be plausible within the setting. Though, of course, when my characters meet aliens who have technology that's, Clark tech, then I can have a bit of fun with that. But I don't explain much about it. I just explain the effects. If I were to do a far future setting, and I do have a plan to do a sort of Gundam space opera type of story at some point, then I would want to be using exotic energy weapons and thinking about the second order effects. Like Ralph said, the spaceships are going to be hundreds of thousands of miles away at first contact and probably won't close any closer than 20,000 miles, 30,000 kilometers. I mean, they are just dots at that point. So you got to think about how you're going to make this compelling. How do you raise the tension when, there's a light delay between your spaceship that's in seconds, because it's so far away. So it's a difficult thing, but rule of cool, Farscape, I thought had the best rule of cool when John Crichton magicked up a wormhole and said, "You don't want me to do this, but you're forcing me to do this." Pulled the wormhole up, and everything starts falling into the wormhole. So it can be done. Yeah, definitely.
All right. That's a lot of detail to throw into a scene. Speaking of details, what level of detail do you need for it to please readers in military science fiction? Do we need to get to the point where we have technical specs for all the spaceships? And if you can do that, by the way, Elon Musk wants you to call him, and weapon systems, or can you just wave your hand and call it a blaster and move on? Ralph.
Both are perfectly valid. One only has to look at the the amount of source books for various role playing games, and even TV series and other books and other stories. So like the Enterprise technical manual, for example. To know that there's definitely an audience for that. But then you swing it to the other side of the spectrum, and you've got, like, say, the Galaxy's Edge series, where a blaster is just a blaster, and Nick Cole and Jason Arnspach almost aggressively dismiss anyone who wants who wants anyone to sort of duck down into any detail of that, because they don't want that to eclipse other aspects of the story. So you can cater towards both. It depends what story I'm writing. So for the Great War, I define the tactics. I define roughly what the capabilities are of these of the ships, and it's basically there to try and simulate the kind of events and battles of World War II. So I'm kind of forcing the technology into those situations. But then on the other side, on Erebus, I go, and the Sleeping Gods, I go into an immense amount of detail, and there's readers who appreciate both ends of that. But I think naturally I'll probably fall about sort of 75% towards the detail side of things. I like to know what I'm dealing with. I like to explain to the readers, and one of my big challenges is often passing back on exposition once I've written a story, to then sort of like turn it from a technical manual into a compelling reading experience.
Okay,
Wow.
Ashley?
This is a really fine line to ride. So in terms of technical specs, I would only go into that if I was writing a set of rules for a game, which I have done in the past. I wrote a set of rules called Onmu War Machine. Don't bother looking for it. It's been long out of print. It's about nearly 30 years ago. But I have to kind of own up and admit that I'm guilty of putting glossaries of technical details in the back of my books. And I have little jokes, and if you read the glossary and you're a bit of a military buff, you'll get references to technical manuals, a definition of a piece of equipment that says then refer to this technical manual, just because, again, that's the way I roll. But my characters just treat the stuff as stuff. It's like it's a suit, it's a gun, it's a rocket pack. That they kind of do geek a little bit about rotary cannons. I have a couple of sergeants in one scene in the first novel going, yeah, GCALs are great because, just does the biz. So they'll call the stuff by its proper name or nomenclature, but they're not going to wax lyrical on the perceived advantages of a 45 caliber over a 9mm, for instance, because it's just a pistol. And if you want to bring down the pain, you need more than just a pistol. You're talking about artillery, aren't you? There you go.
All right, Tim.
I remember that scene actually Ashley's just talked about, and it's an excellent way of just slipping it in. I think that's an important thing. Talking about the right loadout for the mission that's about to come. And I think there's certainly a lot of people who really like the technical detail, but they if you're going to go down that route, it's the way to feed the detail and to keep the consistency without overloading an exposition in ways that seem inauthentic for the readers who aren't particularly interested. Nobody really wants to. Well, I mean, some people are very happy for the narrative to stop and then there'll be 5 paragraphs detailing the precise details of the technical specs. But there are others who aren't. Certainly, one of the things in terms of fans seem to be particularly interested in precise details of all the weapons specs and TOs and E's and so on. So you may get a slightly distorted view because the people who are really into that are more likely to be really into the fan clubs on Facebook and that kind of thing. But I think it's useful if you have the detail in your head all worked out and you're consistent. I think it's that people talk about the iceberg idea of your world building. If you've figured it all out, then it's by some magical process, it's kind of detectable from the bits that you portray to the reader that the fundamental underpinnings are there, even if you're not actually giving the details.
All right. That sounded intelligent. So I'm going to smile and nod and pretend like I could have
wearing my glasses.
So speaking.
That's right.
So speaking of details, how do you handle the details of daily life for the average soldier? So we're talking your MREs, late pay, cheating wives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, well,
Ashley.
Rule number 1, isn't it? Don't be boring. If you're going to include this stuff, it must be something to be overcome or to develop a character or a solution to a problem. So, I think I have scenes where characters go. I do know I have a scene where a character's taking a shower. So yeah, these things are there, but just don't be boring. Basically, it has to be relevant to either the setting, the character, or the problem.
All right, you heard it here first. The rule of science fiction: don't be boring. All right, Tim.
Yeah, I like to feed in bits and pieces that aren't necessarily essential, but give a little bit of colour, make it a little bit authentic. So things such as letters from home or misunderstandings, things going amiss, weapons jamming. Well, that obviously could be quite dramatic. the food tastes terrible, all these sorts of things. Just a little bit thrown in there. It makes it feel a little bit more lived in, I guess, than if everything always works first time and the only thing everybody ever thinks about is the next battle.
All right.
Yeah,
Ralph?
I would totally agree with Ashley and Tim on there. Firstly, Ashley's rule of don't be boring, or the Chip Manley rule as we call it. As Tim has said, making the universe feel lived in and authentic. And again, one of the things that military science fiction often does is, there tends to be a lot of military veterans who read that kind of thing, and people who want to join the military. And for the people who want to join the military, they tend to be quite interested in that. And for the people who have served, it tends to engender sort of either an affectionate or not so affectionate eye roll, about the MREs and whatnot. Although, so yeah, I like putting in those details as long as they don't overwhelm the story. Generally, I keep them sort of relatively small, but I do think they help build character and or help build characters. How your characters react to these kind of things as well. There's some people who stoically eat whatever's put in front of them, for example. There's other ones who, who want the finest cuisine and whatnot. And so it can be used as important character development and to help the universe feel authentic.
Okay, now that we've covered the broad strokes, what do you think makes good, a bad, or great military science fiction? So we went with Tim first. So Ralph.
As the authentic framework for me is what does it, along with great characters who react, in ways that one would expect in those situations as well. And I mean, one of the things we haven't touched on really is characters, and they are so important to making the story feel real. So it's how whatever the situation, whether it's sort of a contemporary science fiction using contemporary weapons against the alien Blarg who are coming down, or whether it's something in the far future. It's how the characters deal with the situation, because your characters your window into that story. And personally, I like the camera quite close on the shoulder, so to speak. But then also I like it to pan out as well on occasion and show the bigger picture, perhaps. So yeah, great characters is great memorable characters is part of it. Bad military science fiction. For me, I'm a bit OCD, and it's people who don't really do their homework on the basics that kind of grates me a little bit. So they haven't got sort of rank structures down, a consistent rank structure down, or people are doing strange or inconsistent things. You can always have your wild card character, but they should still be kind of operating within a wider framework. And so lack of homework is a big thing for me.
Well,
All right, Ashley?
I'm going to have to go with what Ralph said. I mean, it's got to be characters that the reader can relate to, with real problems that threaten the character without causing the reader to suspend disbelief. So, if one of your characters is using Tabasco sauce to fend off the Rigelian leeches, you better have a good reason why Tabasco sauce does that, because other people go, you what? Tabasco sauce is really great. I love Tabasco sauce. So you don't want to be suspending their disbelief. Though on the other hand, I'm reminded of Skippy's rules of things he's no longer allowed to do, which is a meme that hopefully you guys have come across on the web. And I'm told that all these things that are on this list are based on real things that real doofuses, wingnuts, whatever you want to call them, have done, which have caused, signs to be put on doors to bathrooms that says no horses allowed. So, but again, I suppose I would say light seasoning for this kind of stuff, because you throw too much in, people are going to go, what kind of military is this? So yeah, do your homework. I mean, I'm not military, but I heard some very complimentary things said to me about about the amount of research I did for my military books. And yeah, do your research. That's it.
All right, Tim. How do you follow that?
Well, I mean, the readers, they live your story through your characters, so it's no different from other forms of fiction. You need to have good characters you can relate to and give them good problems. I mean, for me personally, I like to have get the sense of interdependency between people who are in a shared environment, or usually the same unit, who will. Because it's a situation that perhaps people aren't normally involved with. You have to make yourself vulnerable and you have to rely upon other people explicitly. That's quite an interesting thing for me. I want intensity as well, at least at some parts of the story. The thing that for me makes bad science fiction is lazy Hollywood cliches, basically, that are inauthentic. And I think I'm happy to make allowances for the visual medium, perhaps rather or more, and I wouldn't do it with where the stormtroopers always miss and the Daleks always miss. That's all right on the telly. You don't take it seriously anyway, but I wouldn't. That's inauthentic, and it wouldn't work for me in the form of a novel.
The telly. Okay. Another one of those British words for you. I hope you're taking notes, dear listener. So we have another fan-submitted question. So they wanted to know what the panel would thought of the use of acronyms in military science fiction and where the line is between just enough and too much and not enough. So actually,
I love
this
them,
time,
but I do admit that when I'm reading a new book, if I get too many TLAs in the text, I kind of go, do what? What's that mean? And I have to scan back. So I think there's an element of craft that has to be used if we're going to use acronyms and TLAs. Three-letter acronyms is what TLAs is. The military love them. So what I do is, for a start, I put a glossary in the back of the book so that people can just flick through and go, oh yeah, what's that? But when I introduce an acronym, I always add a little gloss the first time I use it. And if it's a rare term that only appears once or twice within the story, then I'll remind the reader with a shorter gloss. A gloss is just a piece of craft business where you go, oh, map, magnetic anomaly project for short, like that. I think that's kind of useful, because there's nothing worse than throwing the reader out because they go, what does that mean? Yeah.
okay. Tim.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm not a massive fan. I do read some military SF. I think I get a little bit overloaded, but I do certainly put them in, and I think they're, to me, it's a bit like a secret code that you share between yourself and the reader. It helps to make it special to them. So it's not just acronyms, but special terms that are unique to your setting. I do like to put them in, but I'm careful not to overload too much.
All right.
Oh, it's such a fine line, and again, different readers like different levels. But in terms of a firm answer, I mean, radio speak, whether in the military, the police, or whatnot, is, I would suggest, virtually incomprehensible to to the average layman, as would like a briefing be, or even sort of the casual conversation that you'd find where individuals naturalise that kind of speak into their own vocabulary, and people just wouldn't understand a lot of it unless you've served in that unit, and it can be as specific as down to a particular unit. So you were Army, weren't you, JR? And you probably wouldn't know what the hell an Air Force pilot was on about if he was in radio contact with someone else. And so it's not just within the difference between civilian and military; it's the difference between individual units. I mean, it is a really massively fine line in using them. I quite like using them. One of the ways I do use them sometimes, and not just acronyms, but kind of military speak overall, is to add a sort of flavour of authenticity. So, similar to sort of how technobabble is sometimes used in harder science fiction. The reader reads it. They don't understand what the hell it's on about, but they trust that the characters do know what they're on about, or what each other's on about. So that's one way it can be used. So, for example, I've got a scene where we've got some Navy, or in the Great War, I've got a scene where some Navy personnel are having a card game with some Marines, and the Marines are talking in sort of virtually one language, and the Navy are talking in another. And there is some obvious crossover there because they work together, but they're still like, what? Yeah, do you mind repeating that kind of thing? That's one of the ways I kind of use it in sort of like casual conversation. Other ways I use it, as I say, is when they're like, for example, I've got a scene where a pilot is launching off a carrier. They're doing their radio checks and pre-flights and whatnot, and they're just rattling through it really quickly. And it's not there really to be understood by the reader. What it's there for is to demonstrate that this is a competent character who knows what they're on about, and then bang, they're away. But you can't have pages and pages of that. It has to be sort of like kind of a dive in and then sort of pull back out and then ready to go. So it's such a fine line, but I think it can be a really powerful tool to add authenticity, but just not pages and pages of it, because I wouldn't even know what, say, an American cop is talking about, if they were speaking in radio speak, and I'm a British cop. So it's got to be carefully done, but it can be powerful.
Okay. All right, so I did a 5-second pause, and we'll do one after you guys answer. Do you have time for 2 more questions, or do you need to wrap it up?
I'm good.
No, good for 2. Yep.
Good for as many as you want.
All right, then we're going to pause for... Well, we went through most of them, so give me just a second. All right, so now let's look at the genre writ large. Do you feel like we're in a boom period for military science fiction, or a bubble that's about to pop? I do know that after a certain Mr. Chris Fox wrote a book about writing to market and how everybody could make gangbusters of cash in the military science fiction field, we did briefly see a influx of new authors. Do you feel like that's trend is going to continue, or will the genre change? How do you think that's going to go, Ralph?
There's no doubt it's a popular genre, and there's an expanding readership, but there's also a massively expanding authorship as well, and that can make it very difficult for new authors to sort of rise into prominence. I don't think it's about to pop. I think it's going to continue expanding. I just think there's going to be a lot more authors who are providing material as well.
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it. What I would say is that if it does pop, it will pop in the trad pub arena, not in the independent arena. But with the caveat that, again, because caveats are my thing, the people who pursue what's hot in a genre are generally Well, it's not their passion. They're just pursuing what's hot. And I think if you have a passion for a genre, and I have a passion for military settings, then I can build a reader base. And as long as I'm not boring and I have good characters, people will buy my books. That's what I think.
Okay. Tim.
Well, certainly there's been a massive boom that has coincided with the rise of the Kindle. I think military science fiction itself has slightly come off its peak, but has plateaued much higher than it was 10 years ago. But I think what's happening is authors who sort of started perhaps military science fiction are pushing into adjacent areas of space opera, space fantasy, science fiction romance even. So the people are there, they're just spreading out. And I think that's a good thing. I think at one point, actually, it got a little bit as if everybody was writing the same book. In fact, specifically Art Royal by Christopher Nuttall. But then I think just as I got worried it was going to just get caught up in the same book every time, I think everybody sort of have now spread out and I've learned their craft perhaps a bit more. So yeah, it's definitely here to stay, and it's still very, very healthy genre.
Okay, and speaking of the genre, how do you think that military science fiction of today is different than it was in, say, the 80s or 90s? And those differences, or lack thereof them, do they make it more exciting? Is it disappointing to you as the genre has evolved? Ralph?
It's interesting because I think you've got to take the overwhelming cultures of the time. So in the 80s, for sure, and very early 90s, you had you had NATO in the West versus the East. So you tended to have sort of stories which took kind of two large empires grinding against each other. In the 90s, I think you tended to find a lot of fallen empire stuff as the antagonists or even protagonists on occasion. And now, obviously, post September the 11th, again, there's been a bit of a culture shift to the kind of war fighting that we have now. Sort of manhunts and kind of invasion levels and more insidious enemies. So there has been an evolution, and of course you find it interesting, and the product which comes out of it exciting. And I think military science fiction again is a really good window for exploring those conflicts and the mindsets of people involved in them. So I like the way that military science fiction can stay on point in exploring current affairs through that lens. So yes, in a simple one-word answer, yes, I find it exciting.
Okay. So what about you, Ashley?
Repeat the question. I've kind of got lost track. It's about changes in the 80s.
Yeah, the changes to the genre over the years, and do you approve or disapprove? Do you like them, hate them?
Well,
your thoughts?
I don't know how old my two fellow speakers are today, but I'm a bit older than perhaps most people. So I can remember back in the 60s and 70s, and there's definitely a change, the wind of change, as Ralph would say. Perhaps if he thought of that to say. I could.
Yeah, I'll go with that. It sounds far more eloquent than me. So thank you for ascribing that to me.
So, going back to the 60s, which is a bit earlier, you'd have things, I'm going to call it general whoop-ass, if it was a big picture story, or private striving to succeed if it was a kind of down and dirty in the trenches story. And obviously, there's always been a continuum between, the big story with the generals and the small stories with the privates. And yeah, there's been a big culture change. So what was popular back then, say Sven Hassel and his Legion of the Damned series, or Leo Kessler's SS stories that he wrote, which are not science fiction, but they kind of embody the changes in culture. So yeah, in the 70s, very much about the Cold War, the big picture in terms of, America versus the Ruskies. Now it's more about the small wars. I love it all. And I think there's room for an author to write stories, very fertile. You don't have to repeat the Battle for Rorke's Drift or even the Battle of Britain, because there's been so many interesting conflicts around the world that can serve as inspiration for future what if stories. What if all our fighting is going to be in urban environments like London, New York, wherever? Will that change what we need? Well, undoubtedly it will. Tanks are not very good within a built-up area, so we might see mecha, combat armor suits that people, wear to protect them, to make them mini tanks to go around the battlefield and survive a very stressful environment. Or we might just see automation with artificial intelligence and remote driven weapons. Though there are problems with that, because as soon as you come up against a peer equivalent, because most of the battles in the last 20, 30 years have been a disparity between one side and the other, technologically speaking, whereas World War II was against a peer combatant. So if we go back to peer combatants, it's going to change the type of war stories that people will write. That's it.
Okay, Tim?
Well, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective here, and that's of the publishing industry itself. So, I mean, I started to become involved with the British publishing side of things in the early 2000s, and then very closely tracked from 2011 what was going on in the independent publishing over on the world of Kindle. And it's things have moved very, very, very rapidly in just a few years at sort of internet speed. And one of the things I think is crucial for military science fiction is that outside of one or two places, perhaps Baen Books, I don't think military science fiction was treated with a great deal of respect or was greatly understood by the publishers who actually published them. It didn't mean that people weren't writing great science fiction, so people such as Ian Douglas over at Harper Voyager, but I don't think the people who published him really understood what he was doing. He just seemed to sell books, and he's our token military science fiction person. And I think that's a big difference. The people who are writing science fiction now, and very successfully as professionals, have got a much wider variety of backgrounds, including a lot more people now with military background. We've said authenticity is an important thing, and I think there's a lot more of that around for those who are looking for it than perhaps there was just a few short years ago. So that's my change.
Okay. Well, that was all of the questions I had prepared. Is there anything you think we should have talked about before I wrap this up? Tim?
No, I think we've covered it really well.
All right,
absolutely. We've explored lots, and it's been an honour to be involved in this panel.
All right, Ashley, was there anything we missed? You got to talk about your lovely mechas?
Lovely mechas. I mean, one thing we could say is iconic books. Okay.
Well, that was the last
question. Yeah.
See, she's a genius, people. All right, so we'll ask you, since you were just talking and you mentioned it, what do you believe are iconic books in the military sci-fi genre, Ashley?
Again, being a boring old grognard when it comes to military science fiction and science fiction in general, I've got a bunch of people that I think the readers are not reading nowadays. So Ian Douglas, though actually people are reading him, Bill Keith is his real name, the Heritage trilogy, and in fact all his Marine books are really, really good, because he used to be a Marine corpsman himself. So, authenticity is just, in there. But there's some other good books like Passage at Arms by Glenn Cook, which is a space combat, which is just awesome. We All Died at Breakaway Station, where the title gives away the ending, but it's a great read. And, if you haven't read it, read it. The Orphanage series by Robert Butner, again, a former military person. And we've already mentioned Mark Cluse, but Front Lines, brilliant.
Yeah, Marco does okay for
well, no, he does okay. He's former military, isn't he? I believe.
Yeah, he was in the German army before he immigrated to the States. All right, so what about you, Tim? Are there any iconic books you believe everybody should read?
The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, that I think Ralph mentioned earlier. Crow, the first of the Union series by Philip Richards, which is a very, very tightly written, as in the people fighting don't really know what's going on in terms of the big battle, which is quite exhausting to read, but very rewarding. Legionnaire, the first Galaxy's Edge book, Nick Cole and Jason Ansbach, of course, and The VCs, which was a military science fiction series that I read in 2000 AD comic back in 79 to 80, which is collected in graphic novel form. So The VCs, 2000 AD, read it.
Yeah, great book.
Okay. Ralph?
I think people have mentioned my natural picks. I'd say Tim C. Taylor, Ashley R. Pollard. Someone wouldn't go wrong in going for their books. Marco Cluse is probably my number one. I can't recommend him highly enough. I love those books. Bigly. What else?
It's a word.
It's a word. I've got a soft spot for Stephen Moss's Fear trilogy as well. If people want to see a kind of development of or an alien invasion from humans having to deal with it today to defeating a huge armada of alien craft, but in a very, very realistic way, that feels really. That's an excellent book. If people want something with a bit of a British flavour to it, considering the panel, there is Nick Pope's Operation Thunderchild, I think it's called. Operation Lightning Strike is the first one. Operation Thunderchild is the second. They're getting on a bit now, but again, they're really excellent alien invasion stories, but in a very hyper-realistic setting. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And what's more, that chap was he was a senior civil servant in the British government who apparently had some responsibility for investigating UFOs in the early day in the 80s and 90s. Who else? I think everyone's pretty much been mentioned. Josh Hayes does an excellent book, Echoes of Valor, a kind of Black Hawk Down in space sort of story, which has an interesting take on these things. It's sort of a police investigation, but during a mission that's gone wrong. There's so many out there, and so many excellent ones as well.
That's a good problem to have. All right, so as we bring this to a close, and we appreciate you, dear listeners, sticking with us for the entire 2 hours. Ralph, how can listeners find you?
Well, obviously Amazon and Audible are two excellent places. Just simply type in my name and my books will come out, as well as a number of anthologies that I've written in. I've got a website again, fairly sort of simplistic landing page, but one can get on. One can sort of get on my mailing list through there. So ralphkern.com. What else is there? I'm a semi-frequent contributor to Keystroke Medium, which I'd suggest that quite a few people know about in the military science fiction fandom circles. And finally, I've got a Facebook page as well. Just type in my name and it'll come up. One of the sort of side notes is I have an excellent artist who works with me, Jamie Glover, who has realised a lot of the equipment, mechs, spaceships, and whatnot in the Great War series, and we showcase them on there. And yeah, I think that's everything.
Jamie Glover does amazing art. I've used him before as well. All right,
Well,
Ashley, how
I
can
have
listeners find you?
Amazon author page both in the UK and the US. Just type my name, Ashley R. Pollard, into it, and you should find that. Facebook, again, type my name in. You should come up with my author page. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashley R. Pollard. You're getting a theme here. And I have a website, though it's just a blog spot. Again, Ashley R. Pollard. And you can find me on Goodreads too. So just search my name. You know my name? There you go.
Outstanding. And Tim, how can listeners find you?
Check out humanlegion.com, where not only can you look at various pretty pictures, but you can join the Legion and receive lots of exclusive stories through all my series, including The Four Horsemen.
Outstanding. And you can find us on our website at www.sfshenanigans.com. Our Twitter is at SFS_show, Sierra Foxtrot Sierra _show. Our email is podcast@sfshenanigans.com. And our Facebook group is facebook.com/groups/SFshenanigans.
Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Chris Winder and Cisca Smalls, I'm J.R. Handley, and this was the Sci-Fi Shenanigans Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of space and all things that go boom. All right, thank you for sticking with us through that archived episode that was in the digital memory hole that we found. We thought you'd enjoy it. So thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the archive for the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back at our regular scheduled time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.